let's jump right in, since we only have 27 minutes left for this conversation. So we've titled today "The End of Governments," and essentially you are arguing that governments are in a legitimacy crisis and have been even before the pandemic, and which I think is an interesting point, that this applies to both democratic and non-democratic countries. So let's maybe start with your argument, as it applies to the world before the pandemic. Why have governments stopped working the way they're supposed to be working?
Yes, certainly. So basically, in the last decade, what we've seen pre-COVID-19 is that in most political contexts, there has been this challenge to the political status quo, or a crisis of political legitimacy recurrently in both democratic and non-democratic contexts. And I think it's worth reflecting in the 2010s, we saw citizens armed with technology, social media, challenging their leaders, their political systems, and specific policies in unprecedented ways. And last year alone was really the year of the street protest, according to many media outlets that were tracking this. Think about the protests that were happening in Venezuela with regards to hyperinflation and the hunger crisis there. In France, we had the Yellow Vest protests. In Lebanon, we had a lot of economic linked protests, especially with regards to the WhatsApp tax, corruption protests in Iraq. And I believe there was a significant movement against the Minister of Justice in South Korea. Unprecedented, but really it's been happening for the last decade in a pre-COVID-19 context. And in fact, a report released by the Institute for Peace and Economics, it's called the Global Peace Index. They have also noted the sustained rise in citizen protests. Specifically, they documented that riots have gone up by over 282%. Strikes have gone up over 800% in the last decade. It's really remarkable to have witnessed this, to observe this. And my students and I at NYU, my graduate students and I, every year in the last 5 years, we've been doing this project with crowdsourced consultancy Wikistrat, where we and this crowd of experts try to brainstorm the risks, the threats to stability that are coming up in the upcoming year. And we've been saying this for a while, that there is this challenge to the political status quo. Perhaps the seeds of a global spring have been planted or embedded in most parts of the world. And there's just seems to be this recurring feeling that there must be a better, more legitimate way to govern, a feeling amongst citizens, and that perhaps we deserve better than what we have. And in that regard, it's as though we're sort of being pushed into a corner that government is, as we know it, it has to evolve. Otherwise, we're just going to be seeing this vicious cycle of a crisis of political legitimacy, where the citizen and the government are struggling. And clearly, there's a decline in the social contract, or a broken social contract in most political contexts. And if you look more broadly, there's been a debate about whether the current political system, whether democracy is even the best system for us still. And there's a seminal study by Yasha Monk, and he's written a book about this as well, that apparently the younger generation in US and in parts of Europe, they don't seem to care as much about having this political system of democracy in place. And I think that is something that we need to keep revisiting, whether our current political structures are really delivering the public goods that we need, given that we are all more engaged, more activists because of social media, because of technology, even in an era of fake news. And I think what's also interesting, that in this period, this decade of a crisis of political legitimacy, where we've been challenging our governments, there have of course been other actors that have tried to fill the gap or fill the void in certain certain contexts. Of course, in some environments, there have been negative actors, terrorist groups, criminal gangs trying to fill that gap or fill the void left by government. But in other environments, particularly in the US, in parts of Europe, you do see the rise of other types of non-state actors. And I'm specifically going to talk about the rise of activist billionaires. In the last few years, they have been more aggressive, more public in sharing their views on policy. And one particular area that has come up recurrently pre-COVID-19, you see a lot of these activist tech billionaires warning us. They're alerting government, they're warning the public, they're telling us citizens that we are, to quote Jack Ma, we are headed for more pain than happiness in the next 15 to 30 years because of automation. That most of us, we were constantly warned, we're going to lose our jobs to robots. There are other examples as well. Sam Altman, he's based in California, recognizing the wave of unemployment that was going to hit us pre-COVID-19 because of automation. He suggested that UBI, universal basic income, might be an appropriate strategy to consider. And in fact, he's even initiated a pilot project to test the viability of UBI, to see if that could be a policy that governments might adopt in the future. And again, there are other examples. I mean, Elon Musk has also talked about this. In Zimbabwe, we've seen an activist billionaire fill the gap or sort of try to kind of overcome this tension between citizen and government. I'm referring to a gentleman named Masi Yiwa, where he offered, in response to this breakdown in relationship between doctors and government regarding poor working conditions, and this is pre-COVID-19, mind you, he offered I believe over 6 million in fellowship money to help ease the plight of these doctors, and in response to the failure of government to tackle this specific policy issue.
Yeah. Let me maybe, I'd love to talk more about the tech billionaires sort of in a latter part, but let's first stick with the, since the series is called The End and the Beginning, let's stick to the end first and then move on to the beginning later. So you made a compelling case. It's very interesting that you mentioned all these protests, because while you were listing them, my reaction was like, that was only last year. So it seems like, we've forgotten a lot because of the pandemic, and of course, because of the pandemic, things that happened before seem like very, very far away. Now, I would argue that even if what you're saying, sort of was true by the end of 2019, that the pandemic has changed that. And the pandemic, in fact, has shown us how important government was, because there was no entity other than government who could mount the response to the pandemic. So how would you respond to that? How does the pandemic factor in to your argument? Doesn't it, in a way, sort of show that governments are still very, very, very relevant?
Yes, and of course, I'm not, I would never argue that we don't need government. I'm not trying to suggest that, but I think what we've witnessed is that the political system, or those actors that influence politics governance, they're evolving. They are including the activists, a billionaire, they are including the tech armed citizen protester. But with respect to COVID-19, I agree with you. I think there was a period after the pandemic was declared by the WHO in March, where I think most of us around the world were just hoping and praying that our leaders would figure it out, that we would, I mean, at least for me, certainly for me as someone who is based in New York, but spent part of the lockdown here in London with my parents, I was hanging on every word of Prime Minister Boris Johnson during his press conferences, and same with, I was hanging on every word of President Donald Trump in the first few weeks of the pandemic. But I think what we're seeing, what we've witnessed in the last few weeks and even the last few months, is that some leaders are falling short, and we're reverting back to this position of, wait a minute, our governments are not delivering what we expect. And we've seen, and there are a couple of examples in the last few months, protests against the lockdown measures, specifically in places like here in the UK, Germany, India, Iraq, and even protests regarding other types of COVID-19 related policies that perhaps are seen as undemocratic. There's now a growing debate about whether contact tracing actually infringes on our individual rights. We're seeing that the pandemic has also been an opportunity for some leaders to be more autocratic, for instance, in Hungary, in the Philippines, in Myanmar. So definitely, I do agree with you that there was a period where governments had, after a decade of perhaps facing this severe legitimacy crisis from citizens, they did have a period where they could regain some legitimacy, where they could prove to us that they are still in charge and they know what to do. But as time has gone on, the level of frustration has increased amongst citizens. And, you know, people are protesting, have been protesting despite a global health crisis to show that they're frustrated with government. And again, I feel as though, although we had a temporary break, this deepening of this political legitimacy crisis has resurfaced. And again, I don't see a near-term solution unless the virus just suddenly, fingers crossed, suddenly just goes away. And I don't see an immediate shift in this narrative where citizens are challenging governments about whether they've done enough. And as time goes on, we're going to have more questions being raised by citizens about economic policy. I mean, already we're hearing governments, despite these massive relief packages, we're hearing some rhetoric from certain finance ministers in certain countries where they're openly saying, you know what, we're not going to be able to help everybody. Mm-hmm. There will be certain unemployed people who won't have support in a couple of months. There will be small businesses that don't rebound. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that we need to be prepared for, that there will be more citizen frustration building that will contribute to where we were already headed, which is this, well, I've labeled it a global spring, where more citizen frustration will be embedded in the fabric of our societies, and governments, unless there's a dramatic shift, will be faced with more challenges to their political systems. And in the sequel to this book, Future World Order, which you mentioned, the COVID-19 effect, I do try to emphasize that we are really headed for a global spring, and it's been exacerbated by the situation with the pandemic and the longer-term inability of governments to really deal with this issue. And yes, it is a very difficult issue, but let's keep in mind that certain governments have succeeded. Certain world leaders, they happen to be women. Jacinda Ardern, for instance, is the classic example, and I've been impressed with her since last year, the way she handled the Christchurch attacks, the aftermath, and called then for a global campaign against hate. And I mean, the fact that she was the only leader talking about this in a decade in which we've seen the proliferation of extremism and hate and other identity issues, I think she knows what she's doing, and she's had remarkable success as well with dealing with the pandemic. And there was a brief outbreak and she's quickly nipped it in the bud. So maybe the pandemic is an opportunity for us to step back and say, what is it that we need going forward? What has worked and what hasn't? And again, in my upcoming book, COVID-19 Effect, first I try to suggest that geopolitically, we know that there's a lack of, we don't have global leadership, and G7, G20 look relatively antiquated. Maybe this is a time to brainstorm or come up with a new types of advisory body with world leaders who have dealt with the pandemic very well. Again, they're female. Maybe this is a time for us to reimagine the social contract, that relationship between citizen and government, and see how these other actors can be taken can be part of the equation. The activist billionaire, the more engaged citizen protester. If we don't have those sorts of discussions, we really are going to be in an even worse position as we continue to navigate the pandemic.
So let me. I do want to follow up on something, because again, like what you said is very interesting, and it's worthwhile repeating. Is that you're seeing this trend, and I think you're absolutely right, across sort of different types of government, different types of countries, whether they're democratic and non-democratic. And so in a democracy, the way you would typically and ideally deal with citizen dissatisfaction is through elections. If you don't like your government, you can vote in a new government. That's why democracies are supposed to work. Of course, in non-democratic countries, in authoritarian systems, the way you would deal with citizen dissatisfaction is by suppressing it. And it seems from what you're telling me that what you're seeing is like that neither of these two strategies seems to work. So it seems not possible to create change through elections, but it also seems that authoritarian countries are increasingly not able to suppress citizen anger through sort of authoritarian means. So can you talk a little bit about that? Why are these two strategies, and they're obviously, one might be better than the other, one is clearly better than the other. Why are they both not working anymore?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I think that part of what we've seen in the last decade is that citizens are just more engaged, given the proliferation of social media, right? I mean, it started with the Arab Spring, but there's just, I guess, more opportunity for us to be able to mobilize, to be more aware of what government is doing or not doing. I mean, enough of these world leaders, besides President Trump, are tweeting. We're able to see what is happening on a more regular basis. And clearly citizens want to have more opportunity to engage with their governments. And in my book, my first book, I do talk about how can we leverage technology to reduce that legitimacy gap, to create more opportunities for citizen and government to have a dialogue and to have more feedback mechanism. I mean, you could even take it a step further and say that we can, if citizens are more engaged and activist and want to be part of the dialogue on government policy, maybe we should think about more opportunity to crowdsource policy. We've seen tame examples of that. For instance, in Finland, I believe they crowdsourced a very non-controversial law. It was to do with a traffic law, but they had more opportunity to get citizen input. And I think that is going to be a strategy. How can we leverage technology to reduce that legitimacy gap? And how can we perhaps reflect on what types of policymakers are having more success? Again, I have to go back to the fact that women leaders seem to be outperforming the men. So I think that this is a time for new ideas. This is a time to be more bold. This is a time to recognize that other types of influencers exist. Just going back to COVID-19, even in this environment, we've seen activist billionaires, again, step up to the plate. And, there are multiple examples in the US, Zimbabwe, Hong Kong as well, with Adrian Cheng, where they have engaged in this sort of, I've labeled it COVID-19 bilateralism. Yes, there are state-to-state interactions happening, COVID-19 bilateralism in the absence of global leadership or a global community. You do see different state actors engaging in COVID-19 diplomacy, but you also have these activist billionaires directly engaging with other world leaders, other countries, and offering medical support, offering masks directly. So the very nature of governance or the political system is evolving as we speak. In the context of COVID-19, is this, how is this going to impact democracy longer term? That's something we need to be aware of. But when just going back to my original point that there's a need to repair the social contract or renew the social contract, we need to take into account these other players. The fact that citizens are not what they were 10 years ago. They are more activists, they are more engaged. Now also activist billionaires are also more involved. I think governments will need to take that new sort of power structure or these new influencers into account.
But let's get to the activist billionaires, which I think might be the end of governments. I think was an interesting thesis, but the activist billionaires, I think, is the one where where you definitely go maybe against the current wisdom. So 4 of these activist billionaires that you have mentioned a couple of times now, mostly positively, were sitting in front of the US Congress yesterday in a hearing. Virtually they did, but still. So at the very least, it seems that the rise of activist billionaires is a very double-edged sword. Aren't you worried about sort of the massive concentration of power and money and connection influence that these people have? Well-meaning as they may be, and I would question that some of them are, but even if we would posit that they're all effectively well-meaning, isn't this very, very worrying? And should we not fight the rise of activist billionaires with everything we can?
I understand your point, and of course, yes, just yesterday, many of these tech billionaires were being grilled by Congress, like you said, and I'm not denying that there's a need for regulation. There's a need for some sort of a set of guidelines, definitely. But when these activist billionaires have offered their policy suggestions, or for instance, UBI, or whether they've engaged in COVID-19 diplomacy in the absence of political leadership, global leadership, they're acting as individuals. They're not acting as necessarily as the CEO or the founder of X tech company. So that is the distinction. But of course, I'm not, it's dangerous to think of an individual who's not elected to be, influencing our lives through their companies, but also shaping policy in the way that I'm suggesting. It is dangerous, and there has to be some sort of guideline or regulation or whatever it is, as I said, a social contract that takes into account what their role should be and where their limit is, definitely. But I think at this stage, it's a desperate situation. So it would be foolish on all our parts and governments and on the part of governments to turn away from an activist billionaire who's saying, look, I've just leveraged my business to create more mass so that more of your citizens don't die. I mean, this is a desperate situation. And again, many of the suggestions they've made pre-COVID-19, warning our world leaders that, you know what, many of your citizens will lose their job, in some cases up to 40%. I don't think we can choose to just ignore that. The next step, maybe the next best thing, is to have these billionaires, activist tech billionaires, in governance officially. I don't know, but I think the bottom line is government as we know it is evolving. Democracy as we know it is evolving. This is not, and let's remember, this is not a post-Cold War era anymore. If anything, COVID-19 has reminded us of that. This is not a US-led world, or US-led multilateralism does not exist. It's not automatic that if President Trump loses, whenever the election is, apparently it might be postponed, according to his tweets, whenever the election is, it's not automatic that if he loses and Biden takes office, that everything will snap back into place. A lot of these debates are going to continue. And this is an opportunity for us to have new dialogue. And I think, frankly, and I guess I'm biased towards the younger generation because I work with graduate students who are in their 20s mostly. I even teach high school students about global risk, political risk, through online education startups. I think their perspective is very important. And I think there should be more opportunity to engage with them about these sensitive issues, rather than dealing with people, with all due respect, who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and still think the world is led by the US, or still think the world is defined by multipolarity. This is the era of non-state actors. It's a post-hegemonic context in which we exist for the moment. And non-state actors, as I've mentioned, the citizen protester, the activist billionaire, even the tech firm perhaps, are influencing our lives, our politics, our economies in ways that we're still making sense of. But we need to be aware of that and think about how this can be adapted or incorporated into our political structures longer term. It will take time. I mean, we have to wait and see, and I wish I had more concrete answers about what we should do now, but I think this is the start of an evolution. We are not at the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama said, that this is the political system, democracy, this is it. There's something that will follow this, and tech is the is the sort of the tech factor can't be ignored, and these tech billionaires cannot be ignored. So those are my views at this stage. Obviously, we are in the era of uncertainty, of shock events. Every month, something new is coming up. So if you ask me this question a month from now, I might change my ideas a little bit, but this is what I think at this stage.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you an impossibly broad question at the end, and then I'm going to demand an impossibly short answer to it. We focused on things being bad. It's kind of the premise of this series, but I do want to end, if possible, on a somewhat hopeful note. And you've mentioned a couple of times that you are predicting what you refer to as a global spring. So again, we don't have a lot of time, but if you just highlight a few things, if all goes well, which it doesn't, but if all went well, like how does this global spring look like? So what can we look forward to? What's the best case scenario here?
Well, from my perspective, global spring is not positive, right? It's about, global spring is about citizens protesting more and challenging governments more, that these policies don't make sense. They're not delivering what we need. So I think this will continue unless there's some sort of evolution of our political structures or incorporation of these other actors that I mentioned. So I don't think it's positive. I think citizens have a right to challenge what's in front of them, but this is a vicious cycle that's been going on for over a decade. The pandemic has reminded us that citizens are still upset, that this will continue. And if you take into account the negative effect of the pandemic economically and politically and socially and geopolitically, we're going to have more of, my point is that we'll have more protests, which is not good for our overall global stability. It means more global risk. It means more opportunity for governments to be struggling and more opportunity for non-state actors that are not so positive, terrorist groups, for instance, to benefit from the chaos.
Yeah. All right. I wanted to end on a hopeful note. Unfortunately, we can't, but we're going to end here nonetheless, at least for this part. Thank you very much, Maha, for being here. Thank you all for having joined. Let me just, before you all leave, remind you that the next episode of The End and the Beginning is taking place exactly 1 week from now, on Thursday, August the 6th. With Suhasini Haidar, the diplomatic affairs correspondent of the Hindu newspaper in Delhi, where we're going to be debating the end of the United Nations ? So with that, thank you very much, and I'll see you over in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say that I'm giving 50% of the profits to the sequel, COVID-19 Effect, to the WHO, because we're all in this together. So I hope you are able to pick up a copy in September or October.
And we'll definitely let everybody know once the book is out. Thank you very much, and see you in the Q&A right after this.